Well, what has Christianity ever done for us? Why should we bother with it? People are saying that Christianity is just piggybacking off the back of other thoughts and philosophies and religions down the years. What do we think of that?
It's a very common question. It's a very common accusation. But this is going to amaze you what you see today, because there are a whole lot of things that we presuppose in our society as good that in actual fact have come from Christianity, even though we don't recognize it. Well, there's this fascinating discussion between Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, otherwise you'd think he'd aged considerably, but Tom Holland, the historian, who's brilliant, who's got a book called Dominion, which is brilliant, and he's such a fascinating character. And he's not yet a professing Christian, but he seems to be heading that direction. And AC Grayling, who is definitely not a Christian, who's got a dreadful book called The Good Book, which is the atheist Bible, which would turn every single one of you into Christians, I think, or anti-atheists anyway. But watch this and see what you think.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge? Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are the property of all humanity.
Okay, David, that was a fantastic little short video there. And I must say both of them have amazing hair, which we don't. But there's some interesting things that it was talking about there, that things have come from Christianity. Just give us a list of what the guts of what he was saying there.
Okay, I'll list them and you can choose them. I have my own particular favorites to comment on. And there are others that we could add as well. But lifelong matrimony. Now, some of these surprised me, and I went away and looked into them a bit. But lifelong matrimony, this was the one that surprised me. Homosexuality and heterosexuality. Secularism and religion, which may be a surprise for some people. Science, I knew that one. Created in the image of God, I knew that one. And Western civilization and universal values. Well, I knew the first. The universal values, I didn't know. And there, as I say, there's a couple of others, if we get time, we'll mention. But which of those do you want to talk about?
Look, I think the secularism and religion is interesting in that that's a good comment that Christianity is able to divide between a religious framework and the secular state, in a sense, or two spheres in which life operates in a way that other cultures weren't. Is that what he's saying?
It is what he's saying. And if you know, there's a guy called Larry Siddentop who's got a book called The Making of the Western Individual. And he talks about how it took really 400 years for the attitude to change. But if you know your ancient history, you would know that everything was religion. There was no separation. And it's Christianity that brought that in. It was Christianity that said that there were things in society that, if you like, the religion or the religious priests and leaders did not control. And that was actually incredibly revolutionary and has remained revolutionary. Ironically, Christianity invented secularism. It's a bit like humanism. Calvin talked about Christian humanism. Well, Christian secularism sounds strange today, but I'm sorry, you secularists, like most other things, you owe us.
So it's, in one sense, what Tom Holland is saying here is in fact the opposite of what Grayling is saying. He's saying that all the things that you are taking for granted, and this is where the universal values comes in, actually had to be based in something other than just the ether. They've got to come from somewhere, and he's saying it's Christianity.
Yeah, because the universal values things, you notice how in Western liberal societies, we are so unaware of ourselves and so arrogant that we assume that everyone else in the world wants to be like us because our values are the obvious ones. Well, duh, they're not obvious. And the things that are good in Western civilization, I would argue, come from a universal value that comes from God. So you cannot have absolutes without an absolute giver, an absolute lawgiver. And that's what Holland is saying. And that's what he recognizes. And that is a unique contribution of Christianity. And if you remove Christianity, you're actually going to remove the universal values. So the justice, the equality, the peace, the tolerance, all these kinds of ideas that people take as givens, actually they stem from Christianity.
And so you've got Genesis 1, where humans are made in God's image, which gives us great value, dignity, and worth. But at the flip side, God becomes human as well. So that really embeds that one, doesn't it?
It does, both those. I remember hearing a Roman Catholic professor at the University of St. Andrews who we actually had him come and speak in our church. He was totally brilliant. And he talked about progress. And he said, you know this, progress is a myth, except technically in terms of some scientific things. He says, and he talked about equality, and he said, there is no basis for equality in modern liberal secularism. The basis for equality comes simply from this statement that humans, all human beings, male and female, are created in the image of God. There isn't, you and I, we're not equal. I mean, we don't have equal hair to AC Grayling and Tom Holland. I can't run as fast as you. You don't have my ability to play chess or my witty repartee. I don't have your money. I mean, that's how inequality works. But basic equality is in our image in God.
Yeah. And so it's a huge issue, and I'd be interested to see what AC Grayling would have responded to that. What about next week? What are we talking about next week, David?
Well, I'm just going to add one other thing and say, you know, one of the things that Christopher Hitchens used to say, name one thing that a Christian can do that nothing else does, and love your enemies was the one that came up.
Yeah.
I do think that next week, well, we're going to come back to Tom Holland. We're going to think a couple of other things in terms of, I'm going to suggest that you look at his book Dominion, or if it's too big for you, I wrote a book called The Dawkins Letters, shameless self-plug, but it's worth looking at in the sense of it looks at some of these issues in that way as well. We'll return to Tom Holland because he's fascinating, and it still won't be the Spider-Man Tom Holland. I didn't even know Tom Holland was Spider-Man. I'm sorry, forgive my cultural ignorance. I'm way above that league. Sorry. But see you next week, guys.
Yes,
Bye.
join us at the kitchen table then. We'll see you next week.